Hey there, and welcome to Crime for Sleep. I know you're having trouble falling asleep, so let me keep you company with true crime stories from around the world. Before we dive in, I'm curious, where did you first hear this one? If you enjoy these stories, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Now get comfortable, and let's get into tonight's case. Story 1. I had been fixated on the wall for longer than I could measure, where the grain of the wooden panel appeared to ripple like a distant, silent current. The room refused to settle, its corners breathing with an undercurrent of unease, resonating in the faintest vibrations underfoot. Every so often, a draft would tease the edges of the wallpaper, whispering of spaces beyond. I clung to the illusion of normalcy, convinced I'd regain my peace if only something tangible would break the monotony. But the shift was imperceptible, a shadow that never was, resting just beyond the threshold of sight. The first time I noticed the sound, I dismissed it as pipes settling, a soft percussion, rhythmic but irregular, like fingertips drumming against wood. It came from somewhere above or perhaps beside. In houses like this one, sound travels in unexpected ways, following paths through walls that make no architectural sense. I told myself this repeatedly, even as I found myself counting the intervals between each tap. She had been living in the apartment below for 3 months when I realized I had never seen her leave, not once. I kept mental notes without meaning to, the way you might track the habits of birds outside your window. The mailbox remained empty. No delivery trucks stopped. No footsteps echoed in the stairwell that weren't mine. The detective asked me to describe her appearance, and I found myself grasping for details that should have been obvious. Average height, I thought, dark hair possibly. She wore a coat that seemed too heavy for the season, but seasons blur together when you spend most of your time indoors. Her face remains frustratingly vague in my memory, as if I had only ever glimpsed it through frosted glass. I started leaving my door open just a crack when I heard movement below. The sound of furniture being dragged across the floor came at odd hours. Heavy, deliberate scraping that suggested purpose but revealed nothing of intent. Sometimes it would stop abruptly, as if she had sensed my attention from above. The building superintendent claimed he had no record of anyone renting the unit below mine. He showed me the ledger, running his finger down columns of names and dates, none of which matched my observations. His confusion seemed genuine, but confusion can be performed as easily as any other emotion. I wondered what he gained by lying, if indeed he was lying. My own apartment began to feel foreign. Objects appeared slightly displaced from where I remembered leaving them. A coffee cup turned handle left instead of right, books reshelved in an order that followed no system I recognized. These changes were subtle enough that I questioned my own memory, which may have been the point. The tapping evolved into a pattern I started to recognize. 3 quick taps followed by a longer pause, then 2 more. It reminded me of something, though I couldn't place what. Morse code, perhaps, or the rhythm of a song I had forgotten. I found myself responding unconsciously, tapping my own fingers against the table in the same sequence. When I finally worked up the courage to knock on her door, the silence that followed felt dense and expectant. I could sense presence on the other side, the particular quality of held breath that indicates someone listening. I knocked again, using the same pattern I had been hearing. The silence deepened, becoming almost solid. The police report listed my call as a wellness check. I had expressed concern about a neighbor I hadn't seen in several days, though I realized as I spoke to the dispatcher that I had never actually seen her at all, only heard evidence of her existence. The responding officers found the apartment empty, had been empty for months according to the dust patterns and disconnected utilities. I accompanied them inside, though they hadn't invited me. The layout mirrored my own unit exactly, but the walls were bare and the rooms echoed with our footsteps. No furniture had been dragged across these floors recently. No one had been tapping against these ceilings. The air tasted stale and undisturbed. Yet in the bedroom, directly below where I sleep, someone had scratched marks into the hardwood floor. Deliberate scratches forming no recognizable pattern, but clustered in a way that suggested meaning. The officers photographed them dutifully, but offered no theories. Vandalism, they concluded, probably from previous tenants. I began to research the building's history, spending long afternoons in the local records office. The basement apartment had been sealed off after an incident involving the previous occupant, though the details remained frustratingly vague. References to structural concerns and safety violations appeared throughout the paperwork, but nothing specific enough to explain the scratches or the sounds. My sleep became fractured. I would wake to the sensation of movement below, though I knew the apartment remained empty. The tapping resumed with increased frequency, now accompanied by what sounded like muffled conversation. Two voices, possibly more, speaking in tones too low to distinguish words. The building's other residents claimed to hear nothing unusual. When I described the sounds to my neighbor across the hall, she looked at me with the careful expression people reserve for those they suspect might be unraveling. Her concern felt genuine but unhelpful. She suggested I might benefit from speaking to someone professional. I started recording the sounds with my phone, though playback revealed only silence. The files showed the correct duration, indicating that something had been captured, but whatever frequencies I was hearing didn't translate to digital format. This discovery troubled me more than continued skepticism from others would have. The scratches in the empty apartment began to seem familiar. I realized they matched marks I had been unconsciously making on my own floor, dragging my chair across the same paths repeatedly while working at my desk. The pattern had been mine all along, transmitted downward through some acoustic phenomenon I didn't understand. But this explanation satisfied nothing. The voices continued, more distinct now, though still incomprehensible. I could distinguish between speakers, track the flow of conversation even without understanding the content. They seemed to be discussing me, pausing when I moved around my apartment, resuming when I settled. The detective's final question haunted me. Had I ever considered that the sounds might be coming from inside my own apartment? The suggestion felt absurd, but absurdity had become a frequent companion. I began to doubt not just my perceptions, but my memory of them. Standing in my kitchen this morning, I noticed the wall grain had shifted again, the wooden panel rippling with that same silent current. The tapping resumed, but now I couldn't tell if it was coming from below or if I was creating it myself. My fingers unconsciously drumming against the counter in a rhythm that had become as natural as breathing. Story 2. It started as a slight imperfection, a single dog-eared page in the magazine on the coffee table. Every week another page was folded down, marking a new corner unnoticed at first. I'd straighten them, thinking it was just a quirk of the paper or perhaps a passing breeze. Each time I returned it to its place, the next issue would arrive with yet another corner turned. 5 weeks in, the routine was broken. This time, the magazine lay untouched, pristine. But the corner of the newspaper in the next room was bent instead, and I'm certain I was reading it just yesterday. The certainty troubles me now as I sit here watching the light fade through the Venetian blinds. Certainty has become a foreign concept, something I once wore like comfortable shoes that no longer fit. The newspaper sits where I left it, or where I think I left it, the corner still folded with mathematical precision. Someone has been in my house. I keep returning to that first magazine, the way the page felt between my fingers when I discovered it. Glossy, resistant to my attempts to flatten it completely. There was always a ghost of the crease remaining, a memory pressed into the paper. The article beneath the fold was about home security systems, which strikes me as either deeply ironic or perfectly orchestrated. I can't decide which possibility disturbs me more. The pattern began to consume my thoughts during those long afternoons when the house settled around me like a held breath. I would walk through each room, cataloging the placement of objects, the angle of picture frames, the precise distance between the salt and pepper shakers on the kitchen counter. My world had become a museum of my own making, and someone was rearranging the exhibits. But when did the watching begin? I find myself circling back to this question, pulling at it like a loose thread. Was it before the magazines, or did my attention to the magazines create the watching? The chicken and egg of paranoia, endless and consuming. I remember sitting in the armchair by the window, the one that faces the street, and feeling eyes on my back, not from outside, but from somewhere within the house itself. The sensation was so strong I turned around, expecting to find someone standing in the doorway. Nothing, just the hallway stretching toward the bedrooms, shadows pooling in familiar corners. The coffee table where it all started sits 3 feet from where I write this. I've measured the distance obsessively, using everything from a tape measure to the length of my own stride, 3 feet, 2 inches to be exact. Sometimes it's 3 feet, 4 inches. I tell myself the carpet shifts, that the table has legs that aren't quite even, that houses breathe and settle and move in ways we don't notice. But I notice everything now. My neighbor stopped by last week, or perhaps it was the week before. Time has become elastic, stretching and compressing without my permission. She brought cookies and concern, her eyes scanning my living room with the practiced casualness of someone looking for signs of decline. I caught her staring at the coffee table, at the stack of magazines I'd arranged in perfect chronological order. Did she know about the corners? Had she been the one folding them? The thought followed me into sleep that night, threading through my dreams like smoke. I woke to find my bedroom door open 6 inches wider than I remembered closing it. The hallway beyond was dark, but not empty, never empty anymore. I lay there listening to the house breathe around me, to the small sounds that might have been settling wood or careful footsteps. In the morning, I found another corner folded in the magazine by my bed, the one I keep for reading before sleep. I've started leaving tests for myself or for whoever shares this space with me. A pencil placed at a specific angle on the kitchen counter, a book left open to page 47, a coffee cup positioned just so on the windowsill. Each morning brings subtle changes, adjustments so small they could be explained by memory's failures or the house's natural movements, but they accumulate like evidence in a case I can't quite solve. The newspaper corner haunts me most of all. I remember reading that paper, remember the story about the missing woman found after 3 months in her own basement, hidden behind a false wall. She'd been there all along while her family searched and the police investigated and the neighbors whispered about foul play. The corner folded right through her photograph, bisecting her face in a way that seemed deliberately cruel. Sometimes I stand in my basement and wonder if someone could hide here too. The space feels larger than it should, full of shadows that shift when I'm not looking directly at them. I've walked every inch, measured every wall, but the feeling persists. Someone could be here. Someone could have been here all along. The magazines have stopped coming. I didn't cancel my subscription, but they've stopped arriving nonetheless. The mailbox sits empty except for bills and advertisements, none of which develop mysterious creases. I should feel relieved, but instead I feel abandoned, as if my invisible companion has grown bored with our game. The silence is worse than the subtle violations ever were. I find myself creating new tests, new opportunities for contact. A magazine borrowed from the library left open on the coffee table. A newspaper purchased from the corner store spread across the kitchen island. I wait and watch and hope for the familiar sensation of discovery, the thrill of finding evidence that I'm not alone. But the pages remain smooth, unmarked, indifferent to my need for proof. The house feels different now, expectant. I move through rooms that seem to hold their breath, waiting for something I can't name. The coffee table sits in its precise location, 3 feet and 2 inches from my chair, supporting a stack of unmarked publications. I straighten them compulsively, checking each corner, each page, searching for the imperfection that started it all. Last night I dreamed of folded corners, of pages that creased themselves while I watched. I woke to find my bedroom door open exactly as I'd left it, the hallway beyond empty and still. But on the coffee table in the living room, a single page was turned down, marking a corner with familiar precision. The magazine was one I'd never seen before, its cover featuring an article about the persistence of memory and the unreliability of perception. I sit here now watching the light change, waiting for the next fold to appear. The certainty that someone shares this space with me has become the only certainty I have left. Whether that someone is real or imagined seems less important than the comfort of their presence. The house breathes around me, settling into evening, and I listen for the soft sound of paper bending beneath careful fingers. The corner remains folded, a small imperfection in an otherwise orderly world. I could straighten it, smooth away the crease, but I don't. Instead, I leave it as I found it, a message from someone who may or may not exist, in a language I'm only beginning to understand. Tomorrow there might be another, or there might not be. The uncertainty has become its own kind of companion. The magazine lies open on the coffee table, its dog-eared page catching the last of the afternoon light. I reach toward it, then stop, my hands suspended in the space between intention and action. Some things are better left undisturbed, some messages better left unread. The corner holds its secrets, and I hold mine, and somewhere in the space between us, the truth waits patiently to be discovered. It started as a slight imperfection, and perhaps that's all it ever was. But in the growing darkness of my living room, with the weight of watching eyes I can't locate and the whisper of pages I didn't fold, that small bent corner has become the center of everything. The point around which my world revolves, marking time not in hours or days, but in the careful accumulation of doubt and the persistent hope that I am not, have never been entirely alone. Story 3. It smelled like rich, damp soil, the kind you'd expect to encounter in a dense, shadowed forest, not in the sterile hallway of an office building. The aroma settled into the creases of my clothes, stirring a memory that clung like cobwebs. I hesitated by the elevator, my fingers brushing the cool metal of the buttons. The scent drew me toward the conference room, its door ajar, leaking tendrils of darkness into the corridor. The room was empty save for a desk chair that faced away, slightly skewed as if recently abandoned. This smell wasn't new. It once enveloped me in places where sunlight rarely reached. I shouldn't be chasing it, yet I found myself stepping inside. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting their pale glow across the polished table. I stood there, breathing in that earthy scent, and felt the familiar weight of knowing something had shifted. Not broken, not destroyed, just moved from where it belonged. Like finding a photograph tucked between different pages of a book, or discovering your coffee cup in a room you never entered. She used to wear that same smell on her skin. The memory surfaces without invitation, the way they always do. Her hands, always slightly cool, carrying traces of potting soil under her fingernails. The small greenhouse behind the building where she spent her lunch breaks, tending to plants that seemed to thrive under her attention in ways that defied the artificial light. I would watch her sometimes through the glass partition, her movements deliberate and tender, as if each leaf held secrets she understood. But that was before the questions started, before I began noticing the inconsistencies. The chair in the conference room creaked when I touched its back, rotating slowly on its axis. Someone had been sitting here recently. The leather still held the faint impression of a body, the warmth of presence. I found myself studying that indentation, the way it curved and dipped, trying to read meaning into its shape, the way I had learned to read meaning into everything else. Her stories never quite aligned, small discrepancies that accumulated like dust in corners you forgot to clean. She would mention visiting her sister on weekends, then reference a conversation they had during a weekday lunch. She would describe a movie she claimed to have watched alone, then later refer to details that suggested she had discussed it with someone else immediately after viewing it. These weren't lies exactly, more like fragments of truth arranged in patterns that didn't quite fit together. I began keeping mental notes, not intentionally at first. The mind has its own way of cataloging inconsistencies, filing them away in places we pretend don't exist. But once you start noticing, you can't stop. It becomes a compulsion, this gathering of small betrayals, this collection of moments that don't add up. The soil smell grew stronger as I moved deeper into the conference room. There in the corner where the carpet met the wall, I found its source. A small smear of dirt, barely visible unless you knew to look for it. Fresh earth, rich and dark, pressed into the industrial weave of the flooring. Someone had tracked it in recently, someone who had been somewhere they shouldn't have been. Or perhaps somewhere they had every right to be, and I was the one who didn't belong. This is the problem with suspicion. It turns you into an archaeologist of your own life, excavating meaning from the mundane. Every scuff mark becomes evidence. Every misplaced object transforms into testimony. You start building cases from coincidence, constructing narratives from the negative spaces between facts. She had been different after the promotion, not dramatically, not in ways that others would notice. But I had learned to read the subtle shifts in her demeanor, the microscopic changes in her routine. She started staying later at the office, but her computer logs showed normal activity patterns. She began carrying a second phone, claiming it was for work, but I never saw her use it during business hours. She developed new habits, checking her reflection more frequently, adjusting her appearance in ways that suggested she was being observed by someone whose opinion mattered. The greenhouse visit stopped entirely. I remember standing in the hallway where I now stood, watching her through the glass walls of her office. She was on a call, her voice too low for me to hear, her posture suggesting intimacy rather than professional discussion. The conversation lasted exactly 17 minutes. I had timed it without meaning to, the way you count the seconds between lightning and thunder, measuring the distance of approaching storms. When she hung up, she sat motionless for several minutes, staring at something on her desk that I couldn't see from my angle. Her hands were folded in her lap, her breathing slow and deliberate. She looked like someone who had just received news that would change everything, but hadn't yet decided whether that change was welcome or catastrophic. The next morning, the greenhouse was empty, not just unattended, completely cleared out. The plants, the tools, the small personal items she had accumulated over months of careful cultivation. All of it gone, leaving behind only the faint scent of rich soil and the ghost impressions of pot bases on the metal shelving. I asked her about it during our coffee break, tried to sound casual, merely curious. She claimed maintenance had complained about humidity affecting the building's ventilation system. A reasonable explanation, delivered with the kind of practiced ease that suggested she had prepared for the question. but her eyes held something I had never seen before, a careful distance, as if she were looking at me from very far away. That was when I started paying attention to the elevator. She had always taken the stairs to the third floor, claiming she needed the exercise. But now I noticed her waiting for the elevator, her fingers drumming against her thigh in patterns that seemed almost coded. When the doors opened, she would step inside with purpose, but I never saw her emerge on the floors I expected. The building directory showed nothing unusual: accounting, human resources, legal services, standard corporate infrastructure. But the way she moved through that space suggested knowledge of hidden geographies, secret topographies that existed parallel to the official architecture. I began taking different elevators, timing my movements to intersect with hers, creating accidental encounters that felt increasingly deliberate. She was always pleasant, always professional, but there was a new quality to her attention, as if she were listening not just to my words, but to the spaces between them, searching for evidence of my own hidden intentions. The conference room where I now stood had been her favorite meeting space. She would book it for small gatherings, intimate presentations that never seemed to appear on the official calendar. I would see her colleagues entering and leaving, their expressions suggesting discussions of unusual gravity. They moved like conspirators, but conspirators in service of what cause I could never determine. The soil smell was fading now, dissipating into the recycled air of the building's ventilation system. But I could still taste it on my tongue, still feel its weight in my lungs. It reminded me of burial grounds, of places where things were hidden beneath layers of earth and time, of secrets that grew in darkness, fed by neglect and silence. I found myself returning to this room repeatedly, drawn by impulses I couldn't name. Sometimes I would arrive to find evidence of recent occupation, a coffee cup still warm to the touch, papers arranged in configurations that suggested hasty concealment, the faint impression of handwriting on the whiteboard, visible only when the light struck it at certain angles. But when I tried to focus on these details, they would dissolve under scrutiny, leaving me to question whether I had seen anything at all. This is how obsession works. It teaches you to read significance into randomness, to construct meaning from the chaos of ordinary existence. You become fluent in a language of paranoia, interpreting every gesture as communication, every coincidence as confirmation of patterns that may exist only in your increasingly unreliable perception. She left the company without notice, disappearing between one workday and the next like a person who had never existed. Her office was cleared out with professional efficiency, leaving no trace of her years of presence. The official explanation involved a family emergency, a sudden relocation, circumstances that required immediate departure. But her desk had been cleaned too thoroughly, her files transferred with too much precision. It felt less like an emergency and more like an evacuation. I tried to find traces of her in the building's digital infrastructure, but her access cards had been deactivated, her email accounts closed, her phone extensions reassigned. It was as if the organization had performed surgery on itself, removing her presence with surgical precision while leaving no scars to mark where she had been. The greenhouse remained empty, but sometimes I would catch that earthy scent in unexpected places: the copy room, the break area, the stairwells where she used to walk. It would appear without warning, linger just long enough to trigger recognition, then vanish before I could locate its source, like a ghost that refused to be properly laid to rest. I began to suspect that she had never really left, that her absence was another kind of presence, a negative space that continued to exert influence over the building's hidden rhythms. I would catch glimpses of familiar movement in my peripheral vision, hear echoes of her voice in conversations happening just beyond the range of clear perception. But when I turned to look, when I strained to listen, there would be nothing there except the ordinary sounds of corporate existence. The conference room became my observatory, the place where I would come to think and remember and try to assemble the fragments of her story into something approaching coherence. I would sit in that slightly skewed chair, breathing in the recycled air, searching for traces of the truth that had been so carefully concealed. But truth, I was learning, is not something you discover. It's something you construct from the materials available to you, and those materials are always incomplete, always contaminated by your own need to understand. Every memory is edited by the act of remembering. Every observation is filtered through the lens of expectation. What you think you know is really just what you've decided to believe. The soil smell returned stronger now, filling the conference room with its rich, dark presence. I breathed it in deeply, letting it settle into my lungs, my bloodstream, my memory. It carried whispers of buried things, of secrets planted in darkness and left to grow in silence, of questions that had no answers, only deeper questions that led further into the labyrinth of not knowing. I realized I was no longer certain what I was looking for, or whether I wanted to find it. The search had become its own destination, the mystery its own reward. I had learned to live in the space between knowing and not knowing, in the fertile uncertainty where possibilities multiply like seeds in rich, damp soil. The chair creaked as I stood to leave, rotating slowly back to its original position. The fluorescent lights hummed their electronic lullaby. The building settled into its evening rhythms, preparing for another night of keeping its secrets. But as I reached the doorway, I paused. The soil smell was stronger now, more concentrated, as if its source had moved closer while I wasn't paying attention. I turned back toward the conference room, my fingers brushing the cool metal of the door frame, and saw that the chair had moved again. Not dramatically, just a slight adjustment, a subtle shift that suggested recent occupation. It smelled like rich, damp soil, the kind that clings to your clothes and settles into your memory, stirring recognition of places where sunlight rarely reaches. I found myself stepping back inside, drawn by the familiar weight of knowing that something had changed, that the mystery was still growing in the darkness, patient and persistent as anything that takes root in fertile ground. Story 4. I had just turned off the lamp. The gentle hum of electronics winding down lingered in the background, a faint harmony to the settling dust. My fingertips brushed the textured wall, mapping out the familiar landscape, feeling ridges that seemed deeper than before. The air was still, yet my breath caught on something unseen, a presence that my skin traced like a shadow. It was a soft sensation, elusive, like a memory trying to resurface, and the room didn't seem to agree with itself anymore. The photograph had been moved again, not dramatically, just a quarter-inch to the right, creating a pale rectangle on the dust-covered surface where it used to rest. I noticed these things now, the way you notice a slight fever in your body, that subtle wrongness that makes everything feel foreign. The woman in the photograph smiled the same smile she'd worn for months, but her eyes seemed to follow different angles of the room. When did the suspicion start? I've asked myself this question so many times that the words have worn smooth, like stones tumbled by endless waves. Perhaps it began with the coffee cups, 2 of them in the sink, when I remembered washing only one. Or maybe it was earlier in the way she hummed while folding laundry, a melody I'd never heard her hum before, something that seemed to drift from another life entirely. The house holds secrets in its corners. I walk through rooms that feel both familiar and strange, touching door frames that my hands know by heart yet somehow seem altered. The kitchen counter bears invisible impressions where objects once sat, phantom weights that my fingers can almost detect. I find myself returning to these spaces, searching for evidence of what I cannot name. She used to arrange the books in a particular order, not alphabetical, not by subject, but according to some internal logic that made sense only to her. I never questioned it until I noticed the pattern had changed. The red spine that once anchored the middle shelf now resided at the end, and the collection of poetry had migrated to a different room entirely. When I mentioned this, she looked at me with genuine confusion, as if I were describing someone else's habits. The mirror in the bathroom reflects more than it should. Not supernatural things, I'm not losing my grip on reality in that way, but angles that seem impossible given the room's dimensions. I catch glimpses of spaces that shouldn't be visible, corners that exist beyond the physical boundaries I understand. I've measured the room twice, checking my calculations, but the numbers always come out the same while the reflections continue to show me more. Memory is an unreliable witness. I know this, yet I find myself constructing elaborate theories based on the flimsiest evidence. The way she pauses before answering simple questions, the slight delay in her laughter when I tell familiar jokes, the manner in which she holds her coffee cup thumb positioned differently than it used to be, creating a grip that looks both natural and foreign. I started keeping a journal, documenting these small discrepancies. Page after page of observations that seem significant in isolation, but lose their weight when viewed together. The handwriting is mine, I recognize my own loops and angles, yet reading the entries feels like discovering someone else's paranoia. Did I really write about counting her footsteps on the stairs, about timing the length of her showers, about noting which side of the bed she favors now? The telephone rings at odd hours, not frequently, but with enough regularity to establish a pattern. When I answer, there's breathing on the other end, not heavy or threatening, just the quiet sound of someone listening. I've asked her about these calls, whether she's noticed them, but she claims the phone rarely rings when I'm not home. Her certainty makes me doubt my own experiences, wonder if I'm manufacturing mysteries where none exist. Sometimes I watch her sleep. This isn't new, I've always been a lighter sleeper, often awake while she dreams beside me. But now I study the rhythm of her breathing, the way her fingers curl against the pillow, searching for changes I might have missed. Her face in sleep looks like itself and not like itself, familiar features arranged in expressions I don't recognize. I tell myself this is normal, that sleep transforms everyone into strangers, but the feeling persists. The closet holds clothes I don't remember her buying. Not dramatically different items, just variations on familiar themes. A blue sweater that's almost identical to one she already owns, but with slightly different buttons. A pair of shoes that match her usual style, but in a color I've never seen her wear. When I ask about these additions, she explains them in ways that sound reasonable yet feel incomplete, as if crucial details have been edited out. I've begun to question my own memory. Perhaps the photograph was always in that position. Maybe the books were never arranged the way I thought. Could it be that I'm the one who's changed, that my perception has shifted while everything else remained constant? This possibility frightens me more than the alternative, because it suggests that the problem lives inside my own mind, beyond the reach of external investigation. The basement holds boxes we've never unpacked. We moved into this house seasons ago, yet these containers remain sealed, their contents a mystery even to us. I've started to wonder what's inside them, whether they hold clues to questions I haven't learned to ask yet. The cardboard is beginning to soften with humidity, creating rounded edges that make the boxes look organic, like they're growing rather than decaying. She talks in her sleep now, not words exactly, but syllables that almost form meaning, sounds that hover on the edge of language. I lie awake listening to these nocturnal conversations, trying to decode patterns in the murmurs. Sometimes I think I hear my own name buried in the sounds, but when I focus more intently, the resemblance disappears, leaving only meaningless noise. The garden shows signs of attention I haven't provided, weeds pulled from areas I haven't tended, soil disturbed in patterns that don't match my own gardening habits. When I mention this, she suggests that animals might be responsible, or perhaps the neighbor's children playing where they shouldn't. These explanations satisfy the logical part of my mind while leaving my instincts unconvinced. I find myself studying photographs from before, searching for evidence that the woman in our old pictures is the same person who shares my daily life now. The similarities are overwhelming, every feature matches, every expression falls within the expected range, yet something indefinable seems different. It's like looking at a master forger's work, technically perfect, but lacking some essential quality that can't be measured or described. The routine of our days has remained largely unchanged, yet the atmosphere feels different. Conversations that should flow naturally now contain tiny hesitations, microscopic pauses that create distance where none existed before. We still laugh together, still share meals and quiet evenings, but I find myself listening for false notes in the harmony, watching for tells that might reveal whatever truth is hiding beneath the surface. Evidence accumulates in ways that feel both compelling and meaningless. A hair in the shower drain that's slightly the wrong shade, a coffee stain on a book she claims never to have read, the faint scent of perfume I don't recognize clinging to clothes in the laundry basket. Each discovery feels significant until I try to explain it to myself, at which point reasonable alternatives emerge to undermine my certainty. I've considered confronting her directly, asking the questions that circle through my mind during sleepless hours. But what would I say? That I suspect her of being somehow different than she was, that I believe she's hiding something I can't define. The accusations sound absurd even in the privacy of my own thoughts, too vague to be taken seriously yet too persistent to be dismissed. The house itself seems to be participating in whatever game is being played. Doors that I remember closing stand slightly ajar. Windows that should be locked slide open with suspicious ease. The floorboards creak in patterns that don't match the weight and movement of two people living normal lives. I've started mapping these sounds, trying to determine if they correspond to times when she's moving through the house or if they occur independently, suggesting the presence of someone else entirely. My own behavior has become strange even to me. I catch myself checking locks multiple times, testing windows, examining rooms for signs of disturbance. I inventory objects compulsively, creating mental catalogs of their positions so I can detect any changes. This vigilance exhausts me, yet I can't seem to stop. The need to know has become stronger than my need for peace. Sleep brings no relief. Dreams blur the boundaries between suspicion and paranoia, between observation and obsession. I wake with the taste of uncertainty in my mouth, fragments of nocturnal narratives that seem to offer answers but dissolve under conscious examination. Sometimes I'm not sure if I've been asleep or simply lying still while my mind churned through possibilities. The woman beside me continues her daily routines with apparent normalcy. She makes breakfast, reads the news, tends to household tasks with the same efficiency she's always shown. Yet I find myself studying her movements for signs of performance, wondering if her naturalness is genuine or carefully maintained. The doubt has become a lens through which everything appears potentially false. I've started leaving small tests, a book placed at a specific angle, a glass positioned precisely on a particular surface, coins arranged in patterns only I would recognize. Most remain undisturbed, but occasionally I return to find subtle alterations that could be coincidental yet feel deliberate. These discoveries provide no real answers, only fuel for theories that grow more elaborate and less believable with each iteration. The mirror in the bathroom still shows me more than it should. I've grown accustomed to the impossible angles, the glimpses of spaces that shouldn't exist within the room's physical constraints. What troubles me now is not the visual anomaly itself, but my acceptance of it, the way I've adapted to living with something that defies explanation. Perhaps this is how madness begins, not with dramatic breaks from reality, but with quiet accommodations to the impossible. Time moves differently now, or maybe I perceive it differently. Hours pass without my awareness while I'm absorbed in observation and analysis. I lose track of conversations mid-sentence, find myself staring at familiar objects as if seeing them for the first time. The woman asks if I'm feeling well, her concern appearing genuine yet somehow insufficient, as if she's responding to symptoms rather than causes. The photograph on the dust-covered surface continues its subtle migrations. Each morning I check its position, noting variations so small they might be products of vibration or thermal expansion rather than human intervention. Yet the accumulated changes create a clear pattern of movement, a slow journey across the surface that suggests intentionality. I've never seen her touch the frame, but the evidence of displacement remains undeniable. My fingertips brush the textured wall again, mapping the familiar landscape that feels deeper than before. The ridges seem to have grown more pronounced, creating shadows that shift with the changing light throughout the day. Or perhaps my sensitivity has increased, making me aware of details that were always present but previously ignored. The distinction between external change and internal transformation has become impossible to determine. The gentle hum of electronics winding down creates its familiar harmony with the settling dust. I stand in the darkness, breathing air that carries traces of something I cannot identify, feeling the presence that my skin traces like a shadow. The room doesn't agree with itself anymore, hasn't for longer than I can accurately remember, and I suspect it never will again. The lamp remains off, but the soft sensation lingers, elusive as a memory trying to resurface, persistent as doubt itself. Story 5. The button failed to light up. My finger hovered over it, expecting the familiar glow, but all remained dim. The walls seemed to shrink, closing in, and the air felt unusually thick as I descended. The usual hum of the cables was absent, leaving only a void pressing against my ears. I reached out to touch the cold railing, but it lacked its customary chill. The floor beneath me didn't vibrate with the descent. When the doors finally opened, the hallway beyond seemed to lean away, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the ground wasn't quite level. I keep thinking about her shoes, brown leather, scuffed at the toe. They were still by the door when I came home that evening, positioned as if she just stepped out of them. But she hadn't worn those shoes in weeks. I know because I'd been watching. The maintenance man had kind eyes. He apologized for the elevator malfunction, said these old buildings have their moods. His hands were clean, too clean for someone who worked with grease and machinery. I wanted to ask him about the missing sounds, about why everything felt muffled, but instead I nodded and thanked him. Later, I realized I never saw him leave. She used to hum while cooking, simple melodies that would drift through the thin walls of our building. I'd find myself waiting for those sounds, timing my own routines around them. The humming stopped 3 weeks before I noticed the shoes. The detective asked if I'd observed anything unusual. I told him about the elevator, about the silence that had settled over our floor like dust. He wrote nothing down. His pen clicked repeatedly against his notepad, a nervous habit that reminded me of dripping water. I wanted to mention the shoes, but something held me back. I've been keeping a list of the sounds that have disappeared. The coffee maker's gurgle, the television's late-night murmur, the soft thud of her bedroom door closing. The building feels hollow now, like a shell washed clean by tide. The super showed me the basement storage room where they found her things. boxes stacked with care, labeled in handwriting I didn't recognize. Her winter coat folded neatly on top. I touched the fabric and it felt wrong, too soft, as if it had been washed recently. She never washed that coat. I dream about elevators now, endless shafts that descend into nothing, buttons that respond to thoughts instead of touch. In these dreams, I'm always looking for something I've lost, but I can never remember what. The neighbor across the hall mentioned seeing her leave with someone. A man in a maintenance uniform, she said. They were carrying tools, but when I asked her to describe him, her certainty wavered. Maybe it was a woman, maybe there were no tools, maybe she imagined the whole thing. I found a key in my mailbox. No note, no explanation. It was old brass, the kind that opens doors in buildings like ours. I tried it on every lock I could find, nothing. But I keep it anyway, rolling it between my fingers when I can't sleep. The police tape is gone now, but I can still see its ghost outline on her door frame. Adhesive residue that catches the hallway light. Sometimes I stand there, wondering what they sealed away, what evidence they gathered from the silence. Her mail keeps coming, bills, advertisements, a magazine subscription that won't expire for months. I stack it neatly by her door, though I know she won't return for it. The pile grows taller each day, a paper monument to absence. The elevator works perfectly now. Buttons illuminate on command, cables hum their familiar song, but I take the stairs. Something about that enclosed space makes my skin crawl, makes me think of descent without destination. I've started timing the building's rhythms, when lights flicker in the basement, when the heating system cycles on, when footsteps echo in the stairwell at odd hours. There's a pattern here, I'm certain, but it shifts whenever I think I've grasped it. The maintenance man returned, different face, same clean hands. He asked if I'd been having problems with my apartment. I told him everything worked fine, but he lingered anyway, checking fixtures that didn't need checking. His eyes held no recognition, as if our previous conversation had never happened. I found her journal wedged between my mattress and box spring. How it got there, I can't say. The entries stop abruptly, mid-sentence, ink still wet-looking on the page. She wrote about feeling watched, about sounds in the walls, about elevators that took her to floors that didn't exist. The detective called to say they were closing the case. Insufficient evidence, he explained. People disappear sometimes, especially in cities like ours. His voice carried the weight of resignation, of too many unsolved puzzles. I wanted to tell him about the journal, but when I looked for it again, it was gone. I've been leaving my door unlocked, not intentionally, but I keep forgetting to turn the key. Each morning I discover this small rebellion against security, against the illusion of safety that locks provide. Nothing is ever disturbed, but something feels different each time I return. The shoes are gone now. I don't know when they disappeared, only that the space by her door looks naked without them. I wonder if she came back for them, if she's been waiting for the right moment to reclaim what's hers. Late at night, I hear the elevator moving, up and down, carrying invisible passengers to destinations I can't fathom. The sounds are muffled, as if the building itself is trying to muffle secrets. I press my ear to the wall and listen to the mechanical breathing of a structure that knows more than it reveals. The super handed me a forwarding address. Her family wants her belongings shipped. But when I look at the paper, the writing seems to shift, letters rearranging themselves into different words, different meanings. I fold it carefully and place it in my pocket next to the mysterious key. I think I'm becoming her, wearing her routines like borrowed clothes. I hum while cooking now, the same simple melodies that once drifted through our walls. My shoes find their way to positions by the door that mirror where hers once stood. The building accepts these echoes without judgment. The maintenance man asked if I'd consider moving to a different floor. Better view, he said, more natural light. But I can't leave now, not when I'm so close to understanding. The answer lives in these walls, in the spaces between sounds, in the silence that followed her disappearance. Sometimes I catch my reflection in the elevator's polished interior and see her face looking back. Not a haunting, just a recognition of shared experience, of two lives that briefly intersected in a building that collects secrets like dust. The key fits my lock perfectly, though I never tried it there before. Story 6. I had just brushed the dust off my hands. The floorboards felt unusually warm, each creak underfoot resonating with unexpected clarity. My skin tingled in the dim light, as if sensing vibrations too subtle to catch with my ears. The scent of old wood mingled with the faint aroma of burnt wax, teasing fragments of forgotten rituals. My pulse quickened with each silent step toward the doorway, where the air shimmered like a thin veil. Something shifted, and the quiet felt newly alive. The house had been empty for months before I moved in. That's what the agent told me anyway. But houses remember things differently than people do. They hold on to sounds, impressions, the weight of bodies moving through their rooms. I've learned to listen to what they're trying to say. The first sign was the candle wax. Small pools of it hardened into perfect circles on the windowsill in what would become my bedroom. The agent explained it away previous tenants. She said romantic dinners, power outages. But the wax was arranged too deliberately, too purposefully. 3 circles, each the size of a quarter, positioned with mathematical precision along the sill's edge. I should have paid more attention to the way she avoided looking at those circles when she spoke. Memory works in strange ways when you're trying to piece together what you've missed. I find myself returning to that first walkthrough, replaying conversations that seemed innocent at the time. The agent's nervous laugh when I asked about the neighbors. The way she hurried me past certain rooms, always with a reasonable excuse. The basement needs better lighting, she'd said. The attic ladder isn't safe. But it was her hands I remember most clearly now. How they trembled when she handed me the keys, and how quickly she pulled them back when our fingers touched, as if she were afraid I might feel something she couldn't explain. The house settled around me in those first weeks like an old coat, familiar yet somehow wrong. I'd wake in the middle of the night to the sound of floorboards creaking in the hallway, but when I checked, nothing was there. Just the lingering scent of burnt wax, stronger now, as if someone had been lighting candles in the dark. I started keeping a journal then, documenting the small disturbances, the way certain rooms felt colder than others, how the basement door would swing open on its own, revealing nothing but darkness and that persistent waxy smell. The journal entries read like symptoms now, a catalog of unease that I mistook for adjustment. But there were other things I didn't write down, things that seemed too ordinary to matter. The way the mailman would linger at the end of my driveway, looking up at the house with an expression I couldn't quite read. How conversations would stop when I entered the local grocery store, replaced by polite smiles that never reached anyone's eyes. The clerk who asked too casually how I was settling in, if I'd noticed anything unusual. I told her no, of course. What was I supposed to say? That I'd found more candle wax, this time in the basement, arranged in patterns that looked almost like letters. That I'd started dreaming about voices I couldn't understand, speaking in rooms I'd never seen. The dreams were the hardest part to dismiss. They felt less like sleep and more like memories that belonged to someone else. I would find myself standing in my own house, but it would be different somehow. Furnished with pieces I didn't recognize, filled with shadows that moved independently of any light source. and always, somewhere just out of sight, the sound of someone breathing. I began researching the house's history, spending hours at the local library scrolling through old records. The previous owner had lived there for decades, a woman who kept to herself, who neighbors described as quiet, unremarkable. She died of natural causes, the obituary said. No family, no suspicious circumstances, just an ordinary ending to an ordinary life. But ordinary people don't leave behind patterns of candle wax that seem to tell a story. They don't create spaces that feel haunted by intention rather than tragedy. I found myself returning to the basement more frequently, drawn by something I couldn't name. The wax formations were more elaborate there, covering nearly every surface. Some looked recent, the edges still sharp and clean. Others had been there longer, gathering dust and debris, becoming part of the house's architecture. The patterns meant something. I was certain of that, even if I couldn't decode their message. They reminded me of maps, or maybe blueprints. Diagrams of relationships I didn't understand, connections that existed outside my perception. I started lighting my own candles, trying to understand the appeal. There was something hypnotic about watching the wax pool and harden, about the way flame could transform solid matter into liquid and back again. I found myself staying up later and later, surrounded by flickering light, letting my mind wander into spaces it had never explored. That's when I began to understand what the previous owner had been doing. The candles weren't decorative. They were functional, tools for a purpose I was only beginning to grasp. Each flame created a focal point, an anchor for attention that allowed other things to fade into the background. The patterns weren't random, they were deliberate, designed to guide the eye and mind along specific paths. I started recreating some of the formations I'd found, lighting candles in the same positions, watching how the light and shadow interacted. The house felt different when I did this, more responsive somehow. The creaking floorboards seemed less random, more like a language I was slowly learning to speak. But languages require two participants, and I was beginning to suspect I wasn't alone in my studies. The mailman stopped delivering to my door, leaving everything at the end of the driveway instead. The grocery store clerk found reasons to avoid me, sending other employees to help when I approached her register. Even the real estate agent stopped returning my calls when I tried to ask more questions about the house's history. I told myself it didn't matter. I was learning things they couldn't understand, discovering connections they weren't equipped to perceive. The isolation felt less like rejection and more like protection, as if the house were shielding me from distractions. My journal entries became less coherent during this period, filled with observations that made sense only in the moment of writing. I described colors that don't have names, sounds that existed at the edge of hearing, sensations that felt like memories of touch rather than actual contact. Reading them now, they sound like the notes of someone losing their grip on consensus reality. But what if consensus reality was the problem? What if the previous owner had found a way to step outside its limitations, to perceive things that others couldn't see? The candle wax patterns were becoming clearer to me, revealing themselves as instructions, a guide for navigating spaces that existed parallel to the ordinary world. I stopped leaving the house except for necessities. Everything I needed was here in these rooms, in the flickering light of carefully positioned flames. The outside world felt increasingly irrelevant, a distraction from more important work. The dreams intensified, becoming indistinguishable from waking experience. I would find myself in conversations with people I couldn't see, discussing topics I couldn't quite remember. The breathing sounds grew louder, more distinct, until I realized they were synchronized with my own. I wasn't alone in the house. I had never been alone. The previous owner hadn't died exactly. She had simply learned to exist differently, to inhabit the spaces between ordinary perception. The candle wax patterns were her attempt to leave instructions, to guide the next resident toward the same understanding. But understanding required participation, and participation required sacrifice. Not of life, but of the illusion that life and death were the only options available. I began to see her sometimes in my peripheral vision, moving through rooms with the fluid grace of someone who no longer needed to worry about physical limitations. She would nod approvingly when I lit the candles correctly, shake her head sadly when I missed the subtler connections. The house was her laboratory, and I was her latest experiment. I should have been frightened, but fear requires attachment to outcomes, and I was learning to let go of such constraints. The journal entries stopped making sense because sense itself was becoming irrelevant. What mattered was participation, engagement with possibilities that existed beyond the narrow bandwidth of ordinary experience. The neighbors stopped looking at the house when they passed. The mail stopped coming entirely. Even the utilities seemed to function independently of any external connection, as if the house had learned to sustain itself through means I couldn't comprehend. I was disappearing from the world, but I wasn't dying. I was transforming, learning to exist in the spaces she had mapped with her careful arrangements of wax and flame. The patterns were becoming part of me now, burned into my perception like afterimages that never faded. I could see them with my eyes closed, trace their connections in my sleep, feel their logic pulsing through my veins like a second heartbeat. She was teaching me to become what she had become, to step outside the limitations of singular existence and into something larger, more complex. The house was just the beginning, a training ground for consciousness that could exist anywhere, everywhere, in the spaces between what others call real. I understand now why the real estate agent's hands trembled when she gave me the keys. She had felt it too, the pull of transformation, the invitation to become something more than human. But she had chosen fear over curiosity, safety over transcendence. I made a different choice. The candle wax pools in perfect circles now, each one a doorway to possibilities that can't be explained in ordinary language. The house breathes around me, alive with intentions that predate my arrival and will continue long after my departure. But departure isn't the right word anymore. I'm not leaving so much as expanding, spreading into spaces that exist parallel to the rooms where my body once moved with such clumsy certainty. The floorboards still creak, but now I understand what they're saying. The shadows still move independently of light, but now I know why they dance. The breathing sounds have become a chorus, welcoming new voices, new participants in the ongoing experiment. Someone new will come eventually, they always do. The house will call to them the way it called to me, and they'll find the candle wax patterns I'm leaving behind, more elaborate now, more precise. They'll feel the same tingling sensation in the dim light, the same quickening pulse as they approach understanding. And I'll be here to guide them the way she guided me, through the transformation that waits in the spaces between certainty and doubt. The dust settles on surfaces I no longer need to touch. The floorboards feel warm beneath feet that no longer quite touch them. My skin tingles in light that comes from sources beyond any flame, sensing vibrations that exist in frequencies ordinary ears can't detect. The scent of old wood mingles with burnt wax, creating an atmosphere thick with possibility. Each step toward the doorway feels like a return to something I've always known, a homecoming to a place that exists in the margins of what others call reality. The air shimmers with potential, and the quiet pulses with life that can't be contained by ordinary definitions. Something has shifted, and the silence feels newly alive with voices that speak in languages written in wax and shadow, in the patient breathing of consciousness learning to exist beyond the boundaries of singular identity. Story 7. The ticking was barely perceptible, yet insistent, nestled somewhere within the fabric of the room. It was a tempo that didn't belong, subtly invading the air as I entered. I tried to place it, locate it, but it slipped through the seams of the present, pulling at the edges of a memory I couldn't quite grasp. The walls bore no clock, and my watch was silent still. Each tick, perfectly timed, seemed to echo from a place I had once known, tight with anxiety and whispers. The air grew denser, pressing into my awareness like a shadow I couldn't shake. Though I wanted to dismiss it, every beat of that phantom ticking drew me further into its unsettling rhythm. I realized then this sound wasn't going to let me go. The nausea arrives first, always first. A cold metallic taste that coats my tongue and spreads downward through my chest like spilled mercury. I press my palms against the surface of the desk, feeling the wood grain beneath my fingertips, each ridge and valley a small anchor to something solid. But the ticking persists, and with it comes that familiar weight in my stomach, the one that tells me I'm about to remember something I've spent considerable effort forgetting. My hands are trembling. When did that start? The tremor is slight but persistent, like the aftershock of something larger that has already passed. I watch my fingers as they tap against the desk in unconscious rhythm, matching that phantom metronome that seems to emanate from the very walls themselves. Tap, tap, tap. The sound becomes hypnotic, drawing me deeper into a space I recognize but cannot name. There was a room once, smaller than this one, with wallpaper that peeled at the corners like old skin. The pattern was roses, faded pink roses that had turned the color of dried blood in the dim light. I can see them now, those flowers, wilting eternally in their paper prison. But that's not right. The wallpaper was blue, wasn't it? Blue with tiny sailboats. Or perhaps there was no wallpaper at all, just bare walls the color of institutional beige. Memory is such a liar. I find myself thinking about her hands. They were small, smaller than mine, with bitten nails and a silver ring on her middle finger. The ring had a stone in it, green like bottled glass that caught the light whenever she moved. She was always moving, always fidgeting, her fingers dancing across surfaces as if she were playing an invisible piano. The ticking reminds me of that movement, that restless energy that seemed to vibrate through her entire being. But I'm getting ahead of myself, or perhaps behind myself. Time has become fluid in this space, bending and warping around the steady percussion that fills the air. I close my eyes and try to remember the sequence of events, but they slide away from me like water through cupped palms. There was a conversation, that much I know. Words were exchanged, though I can't recall their exact shape or meaning. The tone was wrong, all wrong, like a song played in a minor key when it should have been major. Her voice had an edge to it, sharp enough to cut, and I remember thinking that this was not how these things were supposed to go. The room we were in had a window, large, facing west, so the afternoon light slanted through it in golden bars that moved across the floor as the hours passed. I watched those bars of light, counted them, used them to measure the progression of our conversation. 1 bar, 2 bars, 3. The light grew redder as it moved, painting everything in shades of amber and rust. She sat in the chair by the window, her silhouette dark against the brightness. I couldn't see her face clearly, just the outline of her profile and the way her hair fell across her shoulder in a smooth curtain. Sometimes she would turn toward me, and for a moment the light would catch her features, illuminating them like a photograph in a developer's bath. But then she would turn away again and the image would fade, leaving only shadows and suggestions. The ticking grows louder now, or perhaps I'm simply more attuned to its rhythm. It matches my heartbeat, or maybe my heartbeat has adjusted to match it. The synchronization is unsettling, as if my body is being conducted by some external force. I can feel my pulse in my temples, my wrists, the hollow of my throat. Each beat is a small reminder that I am still here, still present, still accountable for whatever it is I have done. What did I do? The question surfaces unbidden, rising from some deep place in my consciousness like a bubble breaking the surface of dark water. I push it down, but it resurfaces immediately, more insistent now. What did I do? The words echo in the space between my ears, keeping time with that relentless ticking. I remember standing. The act of rising from my chair was deliberate, calculated. My legs felt unsteady, as if I had been sitting for much longer than I realized. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet, old wood protesting under my weight. Each step was careful, measured, bringing me closer to where she sat by the window. Her perfume hung in the air like a physical presence, something floral but complex, with undertones of vanilla and spice. It was too strong, overwhelming in the confined space, making it difficult to think clearly. I found myself breathing through my mouth to avoid it, but even then I could taste it on my tongue, sweet and cloying. She didn't look up as I approached. Her attention was focused on something outside the window, though when I followed her gaze I saw nothing but the ordinary landscape beyond. Trees, perhaps, or buildings. The details refused to coalesce into anything concrete, remaining stubbornly impressionistic, like a painting viewed through gauze. The conversation we had been having hung unfinished in the air between us. I can remember the shape of it, the emotional contours, but the specific words have dissolved into meaningless syllables. There was anger, certainly, disappointment, a sense of betrayal that tasted bitter on my tongue, but whose anger, whose disappointment, the emotions seemed to exist independently of their source, floating freely in the space of memory. I reached out to touch her shoulder. The gesture was meant to be comforting, reassuring, but my hand felt heavy and clumsy. The fabric of her shirt was soft beneath my palm, some kind of silk or satin that seemed to shimmer even in the fading light. She went very still under my touch, like a small animal that has sensed danger and frozen in the hope of remaining invisible. The ticking continues its relentless march, and I find myself counting along with it. 1, 2, 3, 4. The numbers become a mantra, a way of organizing the chaos in my head. But the count keeps getting interrupted, reset by some internal mechanism I don't understand. I lose track and have to start over. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. There was something in her hand. I noticed it when she finally turned to look at me, her face emerging from shadow into the dying light. Her fingers were wrapped around something small and metallic, clutching it so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. When I asked her about it, she opened her palm to reveal a key. Small, brass, old-fashioned. The kind that might open a jewelry box or a diary. But that's not right either. There was no key. Her hands were empty, resting in her lap like sleeping birds. I'm confusing memories, blending moments that may have happened at different times in different places with different people. The ticking seems to encourage these mental wanderings, each beat an invitation to drift further from the solid ground of fact. I can feel sweat gathering at the base of my neck despite the coolness of the room. My shirt sticks to my back in uncomfortable patches, and I have to resist the urge to tug at the collar. The sensation is familiar, though I can't place when I might have experienced it before. Stress sweat, the kind that comes with difficult conversations and uncomfortable truths. She asked me a question, I'm certain of this, even if I can't remember what it was. The tone was accusatory, challenging. Her voice had taken on a quality I had never heard before, something hard and brittle that made me think of breaking glass. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. The silence stretched between us like a taut wire, vibrating with tension. The light from the window had shifted again, painting the room in deeper shades of red and orange. Her face was half in shadow now, giving her features a distorted quality that made her seem like a stranger. I found myself studying the familiar contours of her cheek, the curve of her eyebrow, searching for something recognizable in this new and unsettling version of her. My hands were shaking more violently now. I clasped them together to stop the tremor, but it only seemed to make the movement more pronounced. She noticed, of course, her eyes fixed on my interlaced fingers with an expression I couldn't read. Was it concern, fear, something else entirely? The failing light made it impossible to be certain. The ticking has become so loud that I wonder how I ever thought it was subtle. It fills the room, drowns out my own thoughts, becomes the dominant rhythm around which everything else must organize itself. I want to cover my ears to block out the sound, but I'm afraid of what might happen if I lose this one constant in the shifting landscape of memory. There was movement, sudden, unexpected. She stood up from the chair, her silhouette dark against the window, and for a moment she seemed impossibly tall, elongated like a shadow cast by a low sun. The key was in her hand again, or perhaps it had never left. She held it up between us, and it caught what little light remained, throwing tiny reflections across the walls like scattered stars. But no, that's wrong too. She never stood up. She remained in the chair throughout our entire conversation, her body language growing more rigid as the light faded. The key exists only in my imagination, a detail borrowed from some other encounter, some other room. I'm losing the thread of what actually happened, allowing my mind to weave together fragments from different experiences into a narrative that feels true but cannot be trusted. The nausea returns, stronger now, accompanied by a dizziness that makes the room seem to tilt and sway around me. I grip the edge of the desk more tightly, my knuckles white with the effort of holding on. The wood feels solid, real, but everything else has taken on a dreamlike quality that makes me question whether any of this is actually happening. I remember the smell of rain. It must have started while we were talking, a gentle pattering against the window that provided a counterpoint to our conversation. The sound was soothing at first, a natural rhythm that seemed to ease the tension in the room. But as the rain grew heavier, it became more insistent, demanding attention, until it was difficult to focus on anything else. She turned to watch the water streaming down the glass, her reflection ghost-like in the wet surface. I could see both versions of her simultaneously, the solid figure in the chair and the wavering image in the window, overlapping and separating like a double exposure. The effect was disorienting, making me feel as though I was seeing her from multiple angles at once. The conversation had taken a darker turn by then. I can feel the weight of unspoken accusations hanging in the air, though I can't recall their specific nature. There was something I was supposed to have done, or perhaps something I had failed to do. The details remain frustratingly vague, like trying to remember a dream after waking. The emotions are clear enough: guilt, shame, a creeping sense of dread, but their source continues to elude me. My breathing has become shallow, rapid. Each inhalation feels insufficient, as though the air in the room has grown thin. I count my breaths along with the ticking, trying to establish some kind of rhythm, some anchor point in the swirling chaos of memory and sensation. In 2, 3, 4, out 2, 3, 4. But even this simple pattern proves difficult to maintain. The rain stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving behind a silence that felt heavy and oppressive. Water continued to drip from the eaves outside, an irregular percussion that interfered with the steady ticking that had become the soundtrack to this entire experience. I found myself straining to hear both sounds simultaneously, to parse their competing rhythms and find some kind of harmony between them. She spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. The words were important, I know that much. They changed something fundamental about our situation, shifted the balance of power or understanding in a way that could not be undone. But the actual content of her statement has been erased, leaving only the echo of its emotional impact. I felt something break inside me when she said it, some essential structure that had been holding me together. The room grew darker as clouds covered what little sun remained. The golden light that had been streaming through the window faded to gray, then to something approaching darkness. I should have turned on a lamp, should have done something to push back against the encroaching shadows, but I found myself paralyzed by the weight of the moment. Moving seemed impossible, like trying to swim through molasses. Her face was barely visible now, just a pale oval floating in the darkness. But I could feel her eyes on me, watching, waiting for some kind of response to whatever revelation she had just shared. My mouth felt dry, my tongue thick and uncooperative. When I finally managed to speak, my voice sounded foreign to my own ears, hoarse and strained. The ticking continues its relentless progression, marking time in a space where time seems to have lost all meaning. I have been sitting here for minutes or hours or perhaps days, trapped in this loop of fragmented recollection. Each beat promises resolution, suggests that the next memory will be the one that makes sense of everything else. But the promise remains unfulfilled, dangling just beyond reach. I remember her standing up, no, sitting down. No, she was always sitting, never moved from that chair by the window. The contradictions multiply, each false memory spawning others until I can no longer distinguish between what happened and what I think might have happened. The ticking provides the only constant, the only reliable element in this shifting landscape of doubt and confusion. There was something wrong with her eyes. They reflected the dim light in a way that seemed unnatural, almost luminous. When she blinked, the effect was momentarily broken, but it returned immediately, giving her an otherworldly quality that made me profoundly uncomfortable. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, an optical illusion created by the unusual conditions in the room, but the explanation felt hollow, insufficient. The key was definitely there. I can see it clearly now, resting in her open palm like a small accusation. It was warm when she pressed it into my hand, warm from her touch and surprisingly heavy for its size. The metal had a tarnished quality that spoke of age, of secrets locked away and forgotten. I knew without being told that this key was important, that it would unlock something I might prefer to leave sealed. But my hand is empty, has always been empty. The key exists only in the space between memory and imagination, a detail my mind has supplied to fill in the gaps in the narrative. I am creating false memories to replace the true ones that have been damaged or lost, constructing a story that feels more real than reality itself. The ticking grows irregular, skipping beats or doubling them in patterns that make no sense. I find myself leaning forward, straining to catch the rhythm, to predict the next tick before it arrives. But the sound has become willfully unpredictable, refusing to conform to any logical sequence. The irregularity is maddening, like a song with measures missing or a poem with broken meter. She reached out to touch my face. Her fingers were cold, surprisingly cold, and they left a tingling sensation on my skin that persisted long after she pulled away. The gesture was intimate, but somehow wrong, like an embrace from someone wearing a familiar mask. I wanted to lean into her touch, to find comfort in the contact, but something held me back. Some instinct warned me that this was not the person I thought I knew. The room has become completely dark now, or perhaps I have closed my eyes without realizing it. The ticking continues in the blackness, more prominent than ever, like the heartbeat of some enormous creature in whose belly I am trapped. I can no longer see her, can no longer see anything, but I can feel her presence like a weight in the air, a disturbance in the fabric of space itself. My hands are wet. When did that happen? I look down at my palms, though I can see nothing in the darkness and feel moisture there. Sweat perhaps, or tears, or something else entirely. The liquid is warm and slightly sticky, with a metallic scent that makes my stomach turn. I wipe my hands on my clothes, but the sensation persists, as though the moisture is coming from within my skin rather than resting on its surface. The conversation is ending, or has ended, or will never end. I can feel the weight of its conclusion settling over the room like a heavy blanket, but the actual moment of termination remains elusive. Words were spoken, decisions were made, actions were taken, but the specifics refuse to come into focus, remaining stubbornly abstract like shapes glimpsed through heavy fog. She is gone now, or perhaps she was never here. The chair by the window sits empty, or appears to sit empty in the darkness that has consumed the room, but her perfume lingers in the air, that complex floral scent that had seemed so overwhelming earlier. It has faded to a whisper now, barely perceptible, but still present enough to remind me that something significant has transpired in the space. The ticking begins to slow, each beat arriving a fraction of a second later than expected. The rhythm that had seemed so urgent, so insistent, is winding down like a clock that has not been wound, like a heart that is gradually failing. I find myself counting the intervals between beats, measuring the growing silence that separates each tick from the next. My breathing has synchronized with the slowing rhythm, each inhalation and exhalation timed to match the phantom metronome that continues to pulse somewhere in the walls around me. The synchronization feels dangerous, as though I am allowing some external force to take control of my most basic biological functions. But I cannot seem to break free from the pattern, cannot reassert my own natural rhythms over this imposed tempo. The key is in my hand again, solid and real and impossibly heavy. I can feel its edges pressing into my palm, can smell the tarnished metal and the faint traces of her perfume that cling to its surface. When I close my fingers around it, the metal warms to my touch, as though it has been waiting for this moment, this contact, this acknowledgement of its presence. But there is no key, there was never a key. My hand is empty, has always been empty, will always be empty. The object I think I feel is just another phantom, another false memory generated by a mind that refuses to accept the gaps in its own narrative. I am holding nothing but air, grasping at shadows, trying to make solid the things that exist only in the space between thought and dream. The ticking stops. The silence that follows is absolute, profound, like the moment after a bell has finished ringing when the air still vibrates with its ghost. I hold my breath, waiting for the sound to resume, for the rhythm that has defined this entire experience to reassert itself. But the quiet stretches on, growing heavier with each passing second, until it becomes a presence in its own right. In this silence, I can finally hear my own thoughts clearly. They are not pleasant thoughts. They speak of things done in darkness, of choices made in desperation, of consequences that cannot be undone. The ticking had been covering these thoughts, drowning them out with its insistent rhythm. Now, in its absence, they rise to the surface like bodies floating up from the depths of a dark lake. I know what I did, have always known, despite my attempts to bury the knowledge beneath layers of false memory and willful confusion. The truth sits in my chest like a stone, cold and heavy and undeniable. She trusted me, and I betrayed that trust in a way that cannot be forgiven or forgotten. The key she gave me opened a door that should have remained closed, revealed secrets that were meant to stay hidden. But even this clarity feels suspect, like another layer of deception in an infinite regression of lies and half-truths. How can I trust my own thoughts when my memories have proven so unreliable? How can I be certain of anything in a world where phantom sounds can seem more real than actual voices, where absent objects can leave tangible impressions on empty hands? The ticking returns, but softer now, more distant, as though it is coming from another room or another time entirely. It carries with it the faint echo of her voice, speaking words I still cannot quite make out, but whose emotional weight I can feel pressing against my consciousness. She is trying to tell me something important, something that will make sense of all this confusion and contradiction. I lean forward, straining to hear, to understand, to finally grasp the truth that has been dancing just beyond my reach. The sound grows clearer, more distinct, resolving into something that might be words or might be just the random firing of neurons in a brain that has been pushed beyond its limits. The meaning hovers on the edge of comprehension, tantalizingly close but still maddeningly elusive. The room begins to brighten, or perhaps my eyes are finally adjusting to the darkness. I can make out shapes now, vague and indistinct but recognizably furniture, walls, the familiar geography of a space I thought I knew. But something is different, subtly wrong, as though the room has been rearranged while I wasn't looking. The chair by the window sits at an angle that seems impossible, and the window itself appears to be in the wrong wall entirely. She is there, or her shadow is there, or the memory of her shadow is there. The distinction has become meaningless in this space where reality and recollection have become so thoroughly intertwined that separation is impossible. She turns toward me, her face still hidden in darkness, and I can feel her eyes finding mine across the impossible distance that separates us. The ticking continues, will always continue, marking time in a space where time has lost all meaning. Each beat is a reminder, an accusation, a promise of revelations that will never quite arrive. I listen to its rhythm and know that I will never escape it, that it will follow me wherever I go, a metronome keeping time to the soundtrack of my guilt. In the growing light, I can see my hands clearly now. They are stained with something dark, something that might be ink or might be something else entirely. The stains form patterns that seem almost meaningful, like writing in a language I once knew but have forgotten. I try to wash them away, but they have seeped too deeply into the skin, become part of me in a way that cannot be undone. The ticking grows louder, more insistent, as though it knows that I am finally ready to listen, to understand, to accept what it has been trying to tell me all along. But even as I strain to decode its message, I know that comprehension will bring no relief, no resolution, no peace. Some truths are too heavy to bear, some knowledge too dangerous to possess. And still the sound continues, patient and relentless, marking the passage of moments that feel like eternities, counting down to something that may never arrive or may have already passed. In its rhythm, I hear the echo of her heartbeat, the whisper of her breath, the soft percussion of her footsteps as she walked away from me for the last time. The key turns in a lock that exists only in memory, opening a door to a room I have never seen but somehow know intimately. Beyond that threshold lies an answer to questions I am afraid to ask, a truth too terrible to speak aloud but too persistent to ignore. The ticking draws me forward, step by reluctant step, toward a revelation that will change everything and nothing, that will explain everything and resolve nothing. I close my eyes and listen to the sound that started this journey, the phantom ticking that has woven itself so thoroughly into the fabric of my consciousness that I can no longer imagine silence. In its steady rhythm, I hear the heartbeat of guilt, the pulse of memory, the endless percussion of a truth that refuses to stay buried. And in that sound, I finally understand that some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. Story 8. I stood at the top of the stairs, fingers brushing lightly over the cold railing. The narrow corridor below stretched into shadow, every inch seemingly familiar and yet foreign. The usual creaks sounded softer, as if muffled by an unseen force. A gentle draft whispered past, but not from the windows. It was as if the air itself was shifting. Each tick of the unseen clock echoed too perfectly, in rhythm with my heartbeat, yet dissonant in its constancy. I waited, muscles tense, for a sign, any sign, that I should move or speak. Then my heart jolted. A rail bracket, one I hadn't noticed before, gleamed freshly polished, its sheen wrong against the surrounding dust. The logical explanation came to me immediately. My roommate had cleaned earlier that day. She'd mentioned something about expecting company, though I couldn't recall the exact words. The bracket must have caught her attention during her usual thorough cleaning routine. She was always meticulous about details I overlooked, always finding spots that needed attention. The gleaming metal simply reflected her careful nature. I descended the stairs, my bare feet silent against the worn carpet. The living room appeared exactly as I'd left it, that morning, magazines stacked neatly on the coffee table, throw pillows arranged just so on the couch. The scent of vanilla candles lingered in the air, though I couldn't see any burning. My roommate must have blown them out before leaving for her evening shift at the hospital. She worked nights in the emergency department, a job that required her to leave by 7:30 sharp. The kitchen showed similar signs of her presence. Clean dishes sat in the drying rack, and the counters gleamed under the overhead light. A single coffee mug remained in the sink, lipstick traces still visible on the rim. I recognized the shade deep burgundy, the color she wore when she felt confident. She'd probably rushed through her coffee before work, leaving just this one item undone. Everything made perfect sense. I could trace her movements through the apartment like reading a familiar story. She'd cleaned, prepared for her shift, maybe touched up her makeup in the hallway mirror near the stairs. The polished bracket was simply evidence of her thoroughness, nothing more. But as I stood in the kitchen, something nagged at the edges of my consciousness. The coffee mug felt wrong somehow, though I couldn't articulate why. The lipstick shade seemed too dark, too deliberate for a rushed morning routine. I lifted the mug, and the ceramic felt oddly warm despite sitting in the cool porcelain sink. A flash of memory surfaced, or was it imagination? I saw her standing at the kitchen counter, but not in her usual scrubs. Instead, she wore a dress I'd never seen before, something elegant and dark. Her movements seemed different too, more calculated, as if she were performing for an unseen audience. The image lasted only seconds before dissolving like smoke. I shook my head, attributing the strange vision to fatigue. I'd been working long hours lately, and stress had a way of playing tricks on the mind. The rational explanation remained solid. She'd cleaned, prepared for work, and left as scheduled. The warm mug was probably just my imagination, influenced by the kitchen's ambient temperature. Yet when I checked the schedule magneted to the refrigerator, her shift wasn't marked for that evening. The calendar showed her next rotation beginning the following night. I stared at the neat handwriting, trying to reconcile this information with my certainty about her departure time. Perhaps she'd picked up an extra shift. Hospital workers often covered for colleagues at short notice. The vanilla scent grew stronger as I moved back toward the living room. I searched for the source and found 3 candles on the mantelpiece, their wicks black but the wax still soft. They'd been extinguished recently, but when, I had no memory of lighting them, and my roommate rarely used candles during daylight hours. She claimed the artificial light interfered with her sleep schedule. Another fragment flickered through my awareness, the sound of voices from earlier that day. Not conversation exactly, but something more intense. Urgent whispers, perhaps, or the kind of hushed tones people used when discussing sensitive matters. I'd been in my room at the time, half asleep, and had dismissed the sounds as coming from the television or neighboring apartments. Now I wondered if I'd been wrong. The voices had felt closer than that, more immediate. One had definitely been hers, but the other remained elusive, neither clearly male nor female, familiar nor strange. It existed at the threshold of recognition, like a word balanced on the tip of the tongue. I returned to the staircase, drawn back to that gleaming bracket. Under closer inspection, I noticed something else, tiny scratches in the metal that hadn't been there before. They formed no recognizable pattern, just random marks that caught the light at odd angles. The scratches looked fresh, as if made by fingernails or perhaps a small tool. The rational mind offered explanations. Cleaning supplies could leave such marks. Metal polish, applied too vigorously, might create similar scratches. Even normal wear and tear could produce these effects over time, only becoming visible once the surface was properly cleaned. But my fingers traced the marks, and they felt deliberate somehow, intentional. Like someone had gripped the bracket tightly, desperately, leaving behind evidence of their distress. The metal was cold again, colder than the surrounding air, and seemed to pulse with some residual energy. Standing there, I became aware of other discrepancies. The hallway mirror hung slightly askew, though neither of us had touched it in weeks. A small rug near the door was bunched at one corner, as if someone had stumbled over it. Most unsettling, the air itself felt charged, the way it does before a thunderstorm, heavy with potential and electricity. These details contradicted my neat narrative of routine cleaning and departure. They suggested something else entirely: struggle, perhaps, or at least significant disturbance. But struggle with what? My roommate had seemed perfectly normal that morning, chatting about weekend plans and complaining mildly about a difficult patient from her previous shift. Or had she? The more I tried to recall our morning interaction, the more elusive it became. I remembered the sound of her voice, but not the specific words. I could picture her moving through the kitchen, but not her exact actions. The memory felt constructed rather than genuinely experienced, like a story I'd told myself so many times it had replaced the actual events. A chill ran down my spine as I realized I couldn't definitively place her in the apartment at any specific time that day. The evidence of her presence, the clean surfaces, the coffee mug, the extinguished candles existed, but I hadn't actually witnessed her creating any of it. She could have been gone for hours or days, and I might not have noticed. This possibility terrified me more than any overt threat. It suggested a fundamental disconnection from reality, a failure of basic awareness that called into question everything I thought I knew. If I couldn't trust my own perceptions about something so simple as my roommate's presence, what else might I have missed or misinterpreted? The apartment suddenly felt enormous and empty, full of shadows that hadn't been there moments before. Every familiar object seemed to watch me with new significance. The magazines on the coffee table were arranged too precisely. The throw pillows showed no indentations from recent use. Even the vanilla scent began to smell artificial, like a cover for something else underneath. I climbed the stairs again, this time heading for her bedroom. The door stood slightly ajar, which was unusual. She typically kept it closed, respecting our mutual need for privacy. I hesitated before pushing it open, uncertain what I hoped or feared to find. The room appeared normal at first glance. Her bed was made with military precision, corners tucked and pillows fluffed. Clothes hung neatly in the open closet. Personal items occupied their usual places on the dresser and nightstand. Everything suggested recent occupancy and care. But the normalcy felt staged, too perfect to be genuine. Real bedrooms showed signs of life, a book left open, jewelry scattered on a surface, clothes draped over a chair. This room looked like a display, beautiful but sterile, lacking the casual disorder that comes with actual habitation. I approached the dresser and noticed that her jewelry box sat open, revealing empty compartments where her most valuable pieces usually rested. The absence might indicate theft, but it could just as easily suggest careful packing for a planned departure. Without knowing her intentions, the missing jewelry remained ambiguous evidence. A photograph on the nightstand caught my attention. It showed the two of us at some social gathering, smiling and apparently comfortable in each other's company. But studying it now, I noticed something odd about our body language. We stood close together yet somehow apart, our smiles bright but not reaching our eyes. The image suggested performance rather than genuine friendship. When had this photo been taken? I searched my memory but found no corresponding event. The background showed unfamiliar surroundings, and our clothes looked expensive, more formal than anything I remembered owning. Yet there we were, captured in apparent celebration of something I couldn't recall. The disconnection between the photograph and my memory created a vertiginous sensation, as if the ground beneath my feet had shifted. If I couldn't remember this significant-seeming event, what else had I forgotten? How much of my life existed only in fragments, pieced together from questionable evidence and unreliable recollections? I left her room and returned downstairs, seeking something solid to anchor my spinning thoughts. The coffee mug still sat in the sink, its burgundy lipstick traces now seeming like a message I couldn't decode. I lifted it again, and this time the warmth was unmistakable, as if it had been used within the last few minutes. The impossibility of this detail forced me to confront an uncomfortable truth. Either my perceptions were fundamentally unreliable, or something was happening that defied logical explanation. Neither option offered comfort, but I found myself leaning toward the former. Mental exhaustion could produce such symptoms, creating false sensations and distorted memories. Yet even as I embraced this rational explanation, part of me remained convinced that the apartment held secrets I was only beginning to glimpse. The gleaming bracket, the scratched metal, the warm mug, these details formed a pattern that my conscious mind couldn't quite grasp, but that my intuition recognized as significant. I stood in the kitchen as evening light faded through the windows, surrounded by evidence of normalcy that felt increasingly artificial. My roommate's absence, which had seemed routine hours earlier, now loomed as a mystery that might never be solved. Had she left voluntarily, or had something else occurred? Was she even real, or had I constructed her existence from loneliness and need? The questions multiplied without producing answers, creating a maze of possibilities where each path led to greater uncertainty. I realized that I might never know the truth about that day, about her disappearance, or about my own role in whatever had transpired. The story would remain suspended between versions, each equally plausible and equally incomplete. As darkness settled over the apartment, I found myself back at the top of the stairs, fingers once again tracing the cold railing. The polished bracket gleamed in the dim light, its scratched surface catching shadows that seemed to move independently. I wondered if I would spend the rest of my life returning to this spot, searching for clues that might not exist, pursuing a truth that remained forever just beyond reach. The only certainty was uncertainty itself, and perhaps that was the most frightening revelation of all Story 9. It always began with the third step on the old staircase, a soft creak that seemed to echo a promise of routine. Each morning I listened for it, a comfort in its predictability as I prepared for the day. But yesterday there was a pause before the sound, an offbeat that caught in my thoughts like a splinter. Today it was silent. The absence lingered, unraveling the morning's calm like a thread pulled loose from a once-tight seam. I wait again, but the step remains quiet, and now I wonder if it ever creaked at all. The coffee grows cold in my hands as I strain to hear what isn't there. The apartment above mine has always been occupied by someone whose habits I knew without ever knowing them. The creak at dawn, the shuffle of slippers across hardwood, the gentle thud of a newspaper being set down. These sounds formed the soundtrack of my mornings, invisible threads connecting me to a life lived parallel to my own. I set the mug down and notice my hand trembling slightly. When did that start? The kitchen feels different somehow, as if the angles have shifted imperceptibly while I wasn't looking. The light from the window casts shadows that seem wrong, too sharp or too soft. I can't decide which. The building superintendent mentioned something last week about repairs, but his words blur together in my memory. Was it about the stairs, the pipes? His face comes back to me in fragments, the way he avoided my eyes, how his keys jingled nervously in his pocket. He'd been standing too close, close enough that I could smell the stale cigarettes on his breath and something else, something metallic and unpleasant. I find myself at the front door, my hand on the deadbolt I don't remember locking. The hallway beyond is dim, lit by a single bulb that flickers intermittently. The stairs stretch upward, each step visible but somehow distant, as if viewed through water. I place my foot on the first step, then the second. The wood feels solid beneath my weight. The third step accepts my foot in complete silence. Standing there, I try to remember the exact quality of the sound that used to greet me each morning. Was it truly a creak, or more of a groan? Did it happen once or twice? The harder I concentrate, the more elusive the memory becomes, like trying to hold smoke in my cupped palms. A door opens somewhere above, and I hear footsteps, but they're different now. Heavier, more deliberate. The rhythm is all wrong, lacking the familiar shuffle I'd grown accustomed to. These feet move with purpose, each step measured and careful, as if their owner is trying not to be heard. I retreat to my apartment and close the door, pressing my back against it. The wood feels cold through my thin shirt, and I realize I'm still in my pajamas. When did I decide to investigate the hallway? The decision feels foreign, as if it belonged to someone else. The phone rings, jarring me from my thoughts. The sound is sharp and insistent, cutting through the morning quiet like a blade. I let it ring 4 times before answering, my voice coming out smaller than I intended. I was wondering if you noticed anything unusual lately, the voice says without preamble. It's a woman, her tone carefully neutral, professional. In your building, I mean. I don't recognize the voice, but something about it feels familiar, like a song heard in childhood that surfaces unexpectedly. Who is this? I'm sorry, I should have introduced myself. I'm calling about your neighbor, the one who lives above you. The phone feels heavy in my hand. What about them? When did you last see them? The question hangs in the air between us. I realize I've never actually seen my upstairs neighbor, only heard them. The morning routine, the evening rituals, the quiet movements that mark the passing of time. They were a presence felt rather than observed, a ghost made real through sound alone. I'm not sure, I admit. But you've heard them recently. Yes, no, I mean I used to. The sounds have changed. There's a pause and I can hear papers rustling in the background. Changed how? I try to explain about the missing creak, the different footsteps, the way the morning routine has dissolved into something unrecognizable. As I speak, my words sound hollow, unconvincing even to my own ears. How do you describe the absence of something you're no longer sure existed? "We'd like to speak with you in person," she says. "Would this afternoon be convenient?" After she hangs up, I sit in my kitchen staring at the phone. The woman never told me her name or who she represented. Police, building management, something else entirely. The conversation feels dreamlike in retrospect, as if I might have imagined the entire exchange. I climb the stairs again, this time continuing past the third step to the landing above. The hallway here mirrors my own, but feels entirely different. The walls are the same color, the carpet the same worn pattern, yet everything seems slightly off-kilter, like a photograph taken at an odd angle. The door to the apartment directly above mine stands slightly ajar. Not open, but not quite closed either, as if someone had pulled it shut without ensuring the latch caught properly. A thin line of darkness runs along the edge where the door meets the frame. I approach slowly, my bare feet silent on the carpet. The gap is narrow, perhaps an inch, but wide enough to glimpse the interior. What I see makes no sense at first. The apartment appears empty, not just of people, but of everything. No furniture, no belongings, no signs of habitation. The floors are bare, the walls unmarked by pictures or decorations. But this can't be right. I've heard someone living here, moving around, following their daily routines. The sounds were real, weren't they? I press my ear to the gap and listen. Nothing. Not even the ambient noise of an occupied space, no humming appliances, no settling sounds, no whisper of air circulation. I push the door gently and it swings open with a soft sigh. The apartment is indeed empty, but not recently vacated. There's a quality to the emptiness that speaks of long abandonment, a staleness in the air that suggests no one has lived here in months, perhaps longer. The floorboards are visible now, and I can see that the third board from the wall, the one that would correspond to the third step in the staircase below, has been removed entirely. In its place is a gap, a dark rectangle that reveals the space between floors. Wires and pipes run through the cavity, and I can see down into my own apartment below. My kitchen is visible through the gap, including the table where I sit each morning with my coffee. From this vantage point, someone could observe my daily routine, watch me prepare for work, listen to my phone conversations. The realization sends a chill through me that has nothing to do with the temperature. I back away from the hole and find myself in what would be the bedroom if this apartment had the same layout as mine. Here, too, there are signs of alteration. Sections of the floor have been lifted, creating a network of gaps and openings. Some are covered with loose boards, others left exposed. The pattern is deliberate, purposeful, designed to provide sightlines into the apartment below. A sound from downstairs makes me freeze. My front door is opening. Footsteps cross my living room, move into the kitchen. I hear the scrape of a chair being pulled out, the soft thud of something being set on the table. Someone is in my apartment, moving with casual familiarity as if they belong there. I creep to the largest gap in the floor and peer down. A figure sits at my kitchen table, their back to me. They're wearing clothes I recognize, my own clothes, in fact. A blue sweater I haven't seen in weeks, jeans I thought I'd misplaced. The person's hair is the same color as mine, cut in a similar style, but something about the way they hold themselves is wrong. The figure reaches for my coffee mug, the one I'd abandoned when I first climbed the stairs. They lift it to their lips and drink, even though the coffee must be cold by now. The motion is mechanical, performed without pleasure or awareness, as if they're following a script rather than satisfying thirst. I want to call out to demand an explanation, but my voice seems to have abandoned me. Instead, I watch as this stranger wearing my clothes performs a pantomime of my morning routine. They open a newspaper that wasn't there before, turning pages at regular intervals without appearing to read. They check a watch I don't recognize, nod as if satisfied with the time, then stand and walk to the window. From my position above, I can see their reflection in the glass, but the image is distorted, fragmented by the angle and the quality of light. The face that looks back could be mine, or it could belong to someone else entirely. The features are familiar yet foreign, like looking at yourself in a funhouse mirror that reveals truths you'd rather not acknowledge. The phone rings again, the same sharp tone that had interrupted my morning. The figure answers it with my voice, speaking words I can't quite make out, but that sound rehearsed, artificial. The conversation is brief, and when it ends, they hang up and return to the table. I realize I'm holding my breath and force myself to exhale slowly. The sound seems impossibly loud in the empty apartment, and I'm certain the figure below must have heard it. But they show no sign of awareness, continuing their strange performance as if nothing has happened. The woman who called earlier mentioned wanting to speak with me this afternoon, but if someone else is answering my phone, using my voice, living in my space, then who am I? The question feels absurd even as it forms in my mind, but I can't shake the growing certainty that something fundamental has shifted in my understanding of reality. I back away from the gap and find myself pressed against the far wall. The empty apartment suddenly feels claustrophobic despite its bareness. The walls seem to pulse with a life of their own, expanding and contracting like the chambers of a heart. I need to get out to find someone who can explain what's happening, but the idea of confronting the figure in my kitchen fills me with a dread I can't name. Instead, I move to the apartment's front door and step into the hallway. The building feels different now, as if I'm seeing it for the first time. Details I'd never noticed before leap out at me: scuff marks on the walls, stains on the carpet, the way certain doors sit slightly crooked in their frames. How long have I lived here? The question should have an easy answer, but my memory feels unreliable, full of gaps and inconsistencies. I descend the stairs, avoiding the third step out of habit, though I now know it would make no sound. At the bottom, I pause outside my own door. I can hear movement inside, the familiar sounds of someone living their life, but they no longer feel like mine. The rhythm is wrong, the timing off, as if performed by an actor who's learned the part but never understood the character. The building's front door stands open, revealing a slice of street beyond. I don't remember it being open when I first ventured upstairs, but then again, I don't remember much with certainty anymore. The morning light has shifted, grown harsher, casting everything in sharp relief. Shadows have weight here, substance, as if they're more real than the objects that cast them. I step outside and immediately feel exposed, vulnerable. The street is quiet, but not empty. A car idles at the corner, its engine running, but no driver visible. Windows in the surrounding buildings reflect nothing, their surfaces black and impenetrable despite the bright morning sun. I have the unsettling feeling of being watched, but when I turn to look, there's no one there. A woman approaches from the direction of the idling car. She's dressed professionally, carrying a briefcase, and her smile is practiced but doesn't reach her eyes. I recognize her voice before she speaks. It's the same woman who called earlier. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," she says, though I don't recall agreeing to anything. "Who are you?" She reaches into her briefcase and produces a badge, but she holds it at an angle that makes the details difficult to read. The metal catches the light in a way that forces me to squint, and by the time my vision clears, the badge has disappeared back into the case. We've been investigating some irregularities in this building, she continues. Complaints about noise, unusual activity, residents reporting strange occurrences. What kind of occurrences? People hearing things that aren't there, seeing neighbors who don't exist, the usual symptoms of prolonged isolation and stress. Her words hit me like physical blows, symptoms. You've been living alone for quite some time, haven't you? No family nearby, few friends, limited social contact. It's more common than you might think. The mind creates companionship where none exists, builds routines around imaginary presences. I want to argue to tell her about the figure in my kitchen, the empty apartment above, the network of gaps in the floor. But as I open my mouth to speak, the words feel hollow, unconvincing. How do you prove the existence of something that might never have been real? The apartment above yours has been vacant for over a year, she continues. The previous tenant moved out suddenly, left no forwarding address. The landlord hasn't been able to rent it since. But I heard someone every morning, the third step, the footsteps, the routine. She nods sympathetically, and I realize she's heard this before from other people in other buildings, other lonely souls who have constructed elaborate fantasies to fill the silence of their lives. The building has structural issues, she explains. Old pipes, settling foundation, temperature changes. These things can create sounds that seem purposeful, human, especially when you're listening for them. I look back at the building, trying to reconcile her explanation with what I've experienced. The windows of my apartment are visible from here, and I can see movement behind the glass. Someone is still in there, still performing their strange pantomime of my life. There's someone in my apartment right now, I say, pointing at the window. She follows my gaze and frowns. I don't see anyone. But the movement is clear, unmistakable. A figure passes back and forth behind the glass, going through the motions of daily life with mechanical precision. I watch as they approach the window and look out, their face a pale blur against the darkness of the interior. Right there, I insist. Can't you see them? The woman's expression grows concerned, and she makes a note in a small pad she's pulled from her pocket. When did you last eat, sleep? Have you been taking any medication, using any substances? The questions feel invasive, accusatory, but I can't ignore the possibility that she might be right. My memory of the past few days is hazy, fragmented. I remember preparing meals but not eating them, lying in bed but not sleeping, going through the motions of life without fully participating in it. I think you should come with me, she says gently. There are people who can help, professionals who specialize in these kinds of situations. I want to resist, to demand answers, to insist on the reality of my experiences. But doubt has taken root in my mind, growing like a cancer, consuming my certainty. What if the sounds I heard were just the building settling? What if the empty apartment above has always been empty? What if the figure in my kitchen is just a reflection, a trick of light and shadow that my isolated mind has transformed into something more? The woman takes my arm, not roughly but with firm insistence, and guides me toward the waiting car. As we walk, I turn back for one last look at the building. The windows are dark now, empty, reflecting nothing but sky. The third-floor apartment where I found the gaps in the floor shows no signs of disturbance, no evidence that anyone has been there recently. But as we reach the car, I hear it a soft creak, barely audible over the sound of traffic and wind. It could be anything, a door, a gate, a piece of loose siding shifting in the breeze. but to me it sounds exactly like the third step on an old staircase, the sound that used to mark the beginning of each day, the comfort I thought I'd lost. I stop walking and listen, straining to hear it again. The woman notices my hesitation and follows my gaze back to the building. "What is it?" she asks. "Nothing," I say, but I'm not sure I believe it. I thought I heard something. She nods and opens the car door, waiting for me to get in. The interior smells of disinfectant and something else, something clinical and cold. As I settle into the seat, I catch a glimpse of myself in the side mirror. The face that looks back is familiar but changed, marked by confusion and doubt, by the weight of questions that have no satisfactory answers. The car pulls away from the curb, and I watch the building recede in the distance. Someone is standing at one of the windows now, a figure I can barely make out, but who seems to be watching our departure. They raise a hand in what could be a wave or a gesture of dismissal, and for a moment I'm certain they're wearing the same clothes I put on this morning, the same face I saw in the mirror when I brushed my teeth. But the distance is too great to be sure, and the angle of the sun creates reflections that could be playing tricks with my perception. By the time I think to point it out to the woman beside me, the building has disappeared entirely, swallowed by the urban landscape like a stone dropped into still water. The car turns a corner, and I'm left with nothing but questions and the fading echo of a sound that might have been a footstep on a wooden stair, or might have been nothing at all. Story 10. It wasn't the first time I noticed the living room clock had stopped at midnight. The hands rested silently against the face as if pausing for breath, their stillness having settled with an odd familiarity. The newspaper lay neatly folded on the coffee table, the date always one day off. I hadn't read it in weeks, but it seemed untouched, as if preserving something that shouldn't be erased. Dust collected on the windowsill, yet I never seemed to wipe it away. I'd start the coffee machine each morning, listening to the quiet hum, not because I needed coffee, but because it had become routine. The air felt thicker on those mornings, though it was just my imagination, surely. I hesitated before turning the clock's hand back to the correct time. The battery wasn't dead. I left it as it was. The scent of lavender lingered in the hallway, though I couldn't recall purchasing any air freshener or bringing flowers inside. It was subtle but persistent, weaving through the familiar mustiness of a house that had been closed too long. I followed it toward the kitchen, where the coffee machine continued its mechanical breathing. The sound felt amplified in the silence, each gurgle and hiss more pronounced than it should have been. My neighbor had knocked on the door the previous afternoon. I remembered her standing on the porch, shifting her weight from one foot to the other, her eyes not quite meeting mine when she spoke. She asked if I was feeling all right, if I needed anything from the store. Her voice carried an undertone I couldn't place, something between concern and caution. When I assured her I was fine, she nodded too quickly and mentioned she hadn't seen the car in the driveway for several days. I told her it was in the garage, though I couldn't remember the last time I'd driven anywhere. The refrigerator hummed louder than usual, a low vibration that seemed to pulse through the kitchen floor. Inside, the shelves held the same items they'd held for what felt like weeks. Milk that should have soured but hadn't. Bread that remained soft despite the date stamped on the wrapper. I closed the door without taking anything, the magnetic seal clicking with finality. In the bathroom mirror, my reflection looked back with eyes that seemed too alert for someone who claimed to sleep each night. The medicine cabinet held the usual array of bottles and tubes, but one prescription bottle sat slightly forward from the rest. I couldn't recall moving it, yet there it was, its white cap catching the overhead light. The label was partially obscured by my thumb when I picked it up, and I set it back without reading the dosage instructions that I already knew by heart. The phone rang while I stood there, its shrill tone cutting through the morning quiet. I let it ring 4 times before answering, my voice sounding strange in my own ears when I said hello. The caller hung up immediately, leaving only the dial tone buzzing in the receiver. This had happened before, though I couldn't pinpoint when. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, yet something about the sequence of digits felt familiar. I walked back to the living room, drawn again to the stopped clock. The brass pendulum behind the glass case hung motionless, catching fragments of light from the window. Outside, the street appeared normal. A woman walked her dog past the front gate, their shadows stretching across the sidewalk. A delivery truck rumbled by, its engine fading into the distance. Everything moved as it should, yet I felt like I was watching it from behind glass, separated by something invisible but impenetrable. The newspaper on the coffee table drew my attention again. I unfolded it carefully, noting how crisp the pages remained despite sitting there for so long. The headlines spoke of events I couldn't quite place in time. A local business closing, a community fundraiser, a minor traffic accident on the highway. The words blurred slightly as I read, not from poor eyesight, but from a strange disconnection, as if the information belonged to someone else's reality. A photograph in the corner of the front page showed a group of people at some kind of gathering. Their faces were small but clear enough to make out expressions of polite attention. One figure in the background caught my eye, someone whose posture seemed familiar, though I couldn't see their features distinctly. I folded the paper back to its original position, aligning the edges precisely. The lavender scent had grown stronger, or perhaps I was simply more aware of it now. It reminded me of something, a memory that hovered just beyond reach. I moved through the house, following the fragrance like a thread leading me through rooms I knew intimately yet felt estranged from. In the bedroom, the scent was strongest near the dresser, where a small glass dish sat empty except for a thin layer of dust. The bed was made with hospital corners, the pillows arranged symmetrically. I couldn't remember making it, though I must have. The sheets were cool to the touch, their surface smooth and undisturbed. On the nightstand, a book lay open to a page I'd apparently been reading, though the words meant nothing to me now. I closed it without marking my place. Back in the kitchen, I opened the drawer where I kept receipts and found them organized in a way that surprised me. Everything was sorted by date, the papers aligned with mechanical precision. My handwriting appeared on some of them, notes about purchases I couldn't recall making. Groceries, household items, a pharmacy receipt with the bottom portion torn off. The dates created a pattern I couldn't decipher, gaps and clusters that seemed meaningful but remained opaque. The coffee machine had finished its cycle, the pot full of dark liquid I wouldn't drink. Steam rose from the surface, carrying the rich aroma that had once provided comfort but now felt like an obligation. I poured a cup anyway, holding it between my palms and letting the warmth seep into my skin. The taste was bitter, more so than I remembered, but I continued sipping while staring out the window at the unchanged street. A car pulled into the driveway across the way, its door slamming with a sound that seemed to echo longer than it should. The driver walked quickly toward their front door, glancing once in my direction before disappearing inside. I wondered if they'd seen me watching, if my presence at the window had registered in their peripheral vision. The thought troubled me in a way I couldn't articulate. The phone rang again, the same insistent tone cutting through my thoughts. This time I answered immediately, but again heard only silence followed by a dial tone. I checked the caller ID and found the same unfamiliar number, the digits arranging themselves in my mind like pieces of a puzzle I couldn't solve. I wrote the number on a scrap of paper and placed it next to the coffee machine, though I wasn't sure why. In the garage, accessible through the kitchen door, my car sat exactly where it should be. The hood was cool to the touch, the windshield dusty from disuse. I opened the driver's side door and slid behind the wheel, breathing in the familiar scent of leather and old air freshener. The keys hung from the ignition, though I couldn't remember leaving them there. When I turned them, the engine started immediately, purring with mechanical contentment. I backed out of the garage slowly, noting how the steering wheel felt slightly foreign in my hands. The street stretched in both directions, familiar yet somehow altered, as if I were seeing it through a filter that changed subtle details. I drove to the end of the block and back, parking in the same spot and returning the keys to their position in the ignition. Inside the house, the stopped clock still showed midnight. I stood before it for a long moment, studying the frozen hands and wondering what would happen if I simply wound it forward. The mechanism wasn't broken, I could see that much. It had simply chosen to stop or been stopped at this particular moment. The silence it created felt intentional, a pause in the flow of measured time that served some purpose I couldn't grasp. The neighbor knocked again, her pattern of 3 soft raps followed by a pause. When I opened the door, she stood in the same position as before, shifting her weight and avoiding direct eye contact. She mentioned seeing my car in the driveway and wondered if I needed anything from town. Her voice carried that same undertone of careful concern, as if she were following a script written for a delicate situation. I thanked her and declined her offer, noting how her shoulders relaxed slightly when I spoke. She lingered for a moment, her gaze drifting past me into the house, and I wondered what she might be looking for or hoping to see. When she finally left, I watched her walk back to her own property, her pace neither hurried nor casual, but something precisely in between. The afternoon brought a heaviness that settled over the house like a physical presence. I found myself moving more slowly, each action requiring deliberate thought. The lavender scent had faded, replaced by something more neutral but equally persistent. I couldn't identify it exactly, only that it seemed to belong to the house itself rather than anything I'd brought into it. In the study, papers were scattered across the desk in what appeared to be organized chaos. Bills, letters, documents that I must have been sorting through at some point. My handwriting appeared on several pieces, notes and calculations that seemed important but no longer made sense. One sheet contained a list of phone numbers, including the one that had called me twice. Seeing it written in my own hand created a disorientation that made me sit down heavily in the desk chair. The evening news played on the television, though I couldn't remember turning it on. The anchor spoke about local events with professional detachment, her voice a steady rhythm that filled the silence without requiring attention. A story about the community fundraiser mentioned in the newspaper caught my ear, though the details seemed to shift each time I focused on them. The camera showed the same gathering I'd seen in the photograph, the same group of faces arranged in polite attention. I turned off the television and sat in the gathering darkness, listening to the house settle around me. Floorboards creaked in empty rooms, pipes whispered behind walls, the refrigerator hummed its constant mechanical song. These sounds had always been present, but now they seemed amplified, each noise carrying weight beyond its physical cause. The stopped clock became a focal point in the darkness, its face barely visible but somehow commanding attention. I approached it again, reaching toward the glass case that protected the mechanism. My reflection appeared in the surface, distorted by the curve of the glass and the dim light. For a moment, I didn't recognize the face looking back at me, though it was undeniably my own. The phone number I'd written down still sat beside the coffee machine, the digits seeming to rearrange themselves each time I glanced at them. I dialed the number slowly, listening to each tone as it registered in the system. The phone rang once, twice, then connected to an automated message that I couldn't quite understand. The voice was familiar but distant, speaking words that seemed important but remained just beyond comprehension. I hung up and immediately felt the urge to call again, though I resisted. Instead, I returned to the living room where the clock waited in its perpetual midnight, its hands frozen in a moment that might have been significant or might have been entirely arbitrary. The newspaper lay beneath it, its headlines speaking of events that felt both distant and immediate, relevant and meaningless. The house held its breath around me, waiting for something I couldn't name. In the silence, I finally understood that the clock hadn't stopped by accident. Someone had set it to midnight deliberately, creating this pause in time for reasons that remained hidden but were undeniably present. Whether that someone was me or another person entirely was a question I wasn't prepared to answer. I left the clock as it was and walked toward the bedroom, where the made bed waited with its precise corners and undisturbed surface. Tomorrow would bring the same routine, the same coffee machine humming, the same scent of lavender appearing and fading like a memory that refused to fully form. The stopped clock would still show midnight, and I would still hesitate before considering whether to wind it forward. In the darkness, I could hear my neighbor's television through the thin walls between our houses, a distant murmur of voices and music that spoke of normal life continuing its measured pace. But here, in this house with its stopped time and careful silences, something else was happening, something that required the clock to remain frozen at the stroke of midnight, preserving a moment that couldn't be allowed to pass.